Okay, so uh, oh, I should start off with a disclaimer. This is not the first attempt at recording this lab. This is number two. The first attempt, I naively assumed that the Windows embedded program snipping tools, it has a screen record feature. I assumed that it would work and take my whole video. I looked up online too. I was just like, hey, snipping tools, like, is there a limit to how long that goes for? The internet said no. Anyways, I get to the end of my first run through. It's about an hour long. I was trying to be in depth, and as soon as I finish it, I click check back with snipping tools. Like, who was first being like, "Oh yeah, bro, I got you. Yeah, just go ahead and get started. We'll take care of this and upload it to YouTube. You won't have to pay Zoom or anything." Found the recording link, and hey, last 6 minutes only. That's cool, right? No, no. So that's what we're at. Yeah, not to worry though. I have tried my best to refresh. I just ate three tornadoes, and I also am accompanied by a vanilla Coke Zero, which will hopefully soothe me to get through this. But anyways, all the more reason to do this a little quickly. So there's my disclaimer. If you feel like my attitude's a little off, there's that, and then also just weird day. Anyways, let's take care of it though. So, thinking, yeah, it says I'm recording. So, all right, Zoom, don't let me down. Okay, so share screen. One sec. There. All right. Ba-da-da-da. Okay, I am screen sharing. Sorry, I just genuinely I have to double check and make absolutely positive that this is working. Okay, great. So, um, sorry, I swear you can like skip past probably most of this, but all right, good, it's working. Okay, sorry. Let's get started. So, today's lab subject, two things. We're going to do a bit of overview for judicial review. Going to go over Marbury v. Madison, talk about constitutionalism, talk about judicial review, a whole bunch, right? That should be about like our first 20 minutes. The second half said Jacksonian era. I was struggle to come up with one title that represented like everything. But anyways, that section portion is going to be on the three new readings for today. So Jackson's speech on the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee Nation Memorial speech, and then lastly, uh, the Henry David Thoreau civil disobedience. Uh, number nine, November 1st. Let's get into it here. Okay, so lab overview, announcements, we'll do those really quickly. Yep, and pretty much everything. No, I didn't just go to the slide. It's okay. Um, okay, so number one, electoral college assignment was due prior to labs. I really hope that didn't give anybody any grief. This is a pretty low stakes thing, just like with the last one with the meme assignment. No right answers. I'm just looking for any effort. So yeah, please, I hope to turn that in. Again, it's just contributing to directly to participation points. There are certain things that we've assigned that are just sort of like optional, a way to compensate for like missed points in other areas of that general point bubble. But this is one of the couple that was required. So, anyways, that's that. But only 2 points, so pretty minimal. Exam two prep Q&A sessions. Just like last time, so we've got the next exam coming up, and just like last time, we TAs are doing The 2 days beforehand of like review room are dedicated solely to exam review. There's going to be plenty of TAs, big spaces that we're reserving. Come, ask your questions, get help. Oh, excuse me. Probably shouldn't be drinking a carbonated drink while on a recording, whatever. Anyways, yeah, Friday, Monday, be there. There are separate rooms. Please pay note to that. I believe with Monday we could quite get one room with like big enough attendance, so I think we're going to have both simultaneously. If you have confusion or can't find any of those spaces, though, please just reach out to the American Heritage Office. You know us in the library. Hopefully, you've been at least once. Secretaries will be happy to point you out where it goes. Okay, so like I said, it's Q&A based. Don't expect PowerPoints. You got to bring your own questions. Mind you, there will be plenty of people asking questions. So if you don't have questions, that's great, man. Still come, sit in the back corner, and keep yourself if you want. I don't care, but just listen. Like, please, like, speaking from personal experience, what was so valuable about the exam review is like, in spite of me thinking I was like pretty good at the studying, which I mean, I got a job, didn't I? Sorry. But you know, I thought I did a really good job of studying. For the most part, I did. But there were always like one or two things, like authors that I thought were just like not important, brushed over, or just like barely heard at all in lecture. Please come and just like hear those questions what they get asked. I think that's really useful. And I mean, don't stay for too long if you don't want to, but yeah, hopefully you see the value. So, let's see. And then obviously, if we're doing exam review, exam is going to happen November 12th to 15th. Review room will be closed during that period. We can't offer any content assistance. Logistical questions we can answer, but yeah. And please also pay a special note to you must have the test in hand by 11 a.m. Friday. This is not one of those exams that like you can like get like at the end of the day right before the testing center closes. They have a cap for our exam because it's such a high capacity, 11 a.m. So be there an hour early, like just in case of lines. Play this really safe. There's nothing really we can do about that. So, anyways, okay, that's that. Um, Yeah, Marbury v. Madison. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be covering three things. Number one, we want to establish the basis of what is constitutionalism as a principle, go over the case of Marbury v. Madison, some big takeaways, and establish the impacts and long-term questions that are, come from this principle of judicial review. Uh, Conveniently, I had the review room topic for Marbury v. Madison, which had a lot of overlap with judicial review being the same thing. So I have a resource for us. Woohoo. Okay, two-page view. Yeah, I think you can see that. Alrighty. So, okay. Marbury v. Madison. So, Federalist 78, quote, just starting off with a quote from Hamilton himself: no legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. Um, Above all else, we are establishing this principle of supremacy, that there is nothing that is supposed to be higher to the Constitution. All laws should be made in reference to it. Now, to be clear, not all laws should not be like making changes or amendments to it, but they should base it as its core, if that makes sense. It is attached above all else. Everything is an like umbrella concept to it, or whatever is under the umbrella. The big umbrella is the Constitution. I think you get me. Um, Okay, so what is constitutionalism? Well, building off this idea of supremacy, constitutionalism is this idea that it is a permanent document and is not intended to be easily amended, especially by simple acts of legislature. So, again, with supremacy, we are holding the Constitution at a high podium above all others, right? Nothing should be bigger than it. And because of that, like we have an obligation and responsibility to make sure that no laws infringe upon that high podium, that nothing except the Constitution is on that high podium. Does that make sense? And so, anyways, I asked this question in labs a while ago, just like I had everybody just raise your hands, being like, How many of you have had at least one amendment be passed in your lifetime? None of you raised your hands. And the same would have gone for me, right? Amendments don't happen very often. And, some of you might like look at that and think like, oh, that's actually a problem with government because, we're so gridlocked, we can't make laws ever like very quickly. I hear you, but there's also definitely an upside to this, right? Again, given that the Constitution is being held on such a high podium, it is the one law that rules all. It is the most influential document legally to your life as an individual citizen. Um, big things that like make such big changes in our lives should not be like happening a lot, right? Or at least when they do, they better be unanimously agreed upon. And so this is why like amendments like rarely ever happen because like rarely ever do we are we proposing like a change to this core document to the American legal system that like everybody wants, that everybody thinks is a good idea. There are radical ideas, of course, they get put around all the time, but rarely do those ever follow. So anyways, this is constitutionalism, right? That like this document is purposely not meant to be changed very much. It is a core supreme document. Now, following along with this, I kind of already mentioned it, but it is inconsistent to talk about supreme law, a supreme law that can be amended by a simple ordinary law. Um, Now, what I've argued here is that laws don't get passed very often on the federal level, right? However, uh, on like well at laws don't get passed especially often at that like high up federal level, but like when we start looking at like local governments, and state governments especially, and even like lower federal governments, which is a region that I don't understand well. I can tell you three branches super great, but yeah, we haven't talked really about like lesser courts. We'll get into that though. um Anyways, what was I saying? um Sorry. Laws don't get passed very often. Large courts, little courts. Anyways, yeah, but like, so big laws don't get passed very often in big level government, but like in small level government, like local state governments, laws get passed more frequently. And with this comes like a little bit of concern that like sometimes we are going to be writing laws that like don't just reference the Constitution, they seek to almost augment it, right? And so federal government, like the national government has responsibility and like a pursuit to find laws that are like infringing upon this and make judgment calls, right? To, like make sure that we keep again the ordinary podium separate from the supreme podium, which is supposed to be mostly untouchable. So Marbury, this begs the question then, who should interpret the Constitution? Well, who better to answer that for us than the case of Marbury v. Madison? Now, I'm going to explain this in a way that hopefully all of you resonate with, and I will do so through the tone and context of high school bro speech. So, there were these two dudes, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? They were like anti-bros, not good vibes with each other. Now, Adams and Jefferson were both former presidents. Adams before Jefferson, and so our story begins at the end of Adams' presidency, after Jefferson has been elected, but has yet to be like put into office. Uh, Adams just has a couple days left, right? And so, anyways, Adams not a big fan of Jefferson. Is like asking himself, like, bro, how can I screw with this guy super hard, and like make his next 4 years suck kind of bad? Well, not completely, but like basically, I want to pull the ultimate prank that like kind of makes his presidency a little bit more of a pain in the keister. And so, what does John Adams does? He goes to sleep, wakes up in the morning, the incredible prank, bro. I should like appoint all of these judges to like positions that like Jefferson can't really get rid of. So his whole presidency, he's gonna have to deal with guys that are like just from my political party, that like again aren't gonna like totally like break the game for him, but like definitely complicate and make his life a little harder because they represent differing views. So, anyways, Adams is just like, this is the Good idea. So let's do it. So what did he do? Well, he drafts this list of like whole crap ton of people that he wants like on this like roster of like federal judges. And mind you, again, when I was saying before that there is like this lower level of federal government, uh, when I say federal judges, I'm not talking about Supreme Court judges. There is like lower federal judiciary courts. Again, I don't have much detail. I can't explain those really well. We haven't talked about it, but they exist. So, anyways, one of these guys in that stack of like dudes that Jefferson wants in on the prank are like is this guy named Marbury. And Marbury is again like he hears the idea and he's like, "Oh, bro, I would love to help you screw with this guy." Also, too, this job sounds really sweet. Get a salary and the prestige. So, he's really in on it, right? So, anyways, uh, the death comes knocking on the door of John Adams's presidency, and it's like you got like 2 or 3 days left. So he's like he's writing all these papers that like officially declare this guy's going to be a new judge, right? But like most of the greatest like conceived pranks, they were thought of a little bit too late. And so the president doesn't quite have enough time to like deliver all of these papers that have officially like determined that like, okay, you are going to be a judge for me, right? So okay, uh, just to clarify, so as Adams has to leave the presidency, he hasn't been able to deliver all of these commissions that like officially declare uh, these guys as like, these lower federal judges. Now, to be clear, he leaves behind this stack of like papers on the desk of the Secretary of State because it was the Secretary of State's responsibility to deliver them for the president. And this stack of papers were all the leftover dudes who had yet to receive the papers. But like technically speaking, they had the signature of the president when the president had presidential authority. So those documents say, like, because they exist, they say that those dudes should be judges now. Like it's official. They just need to be delivered, right? But anyways, Adams has to leave him on the desk, but he kind of expects that, like, when the new presidency happens and James Madison steps up to the plate as the new Secretary of State for Jefferson, he's going to be obligated by his duties to go deliver those commissions to the dudes that they, really wouldn't care for to have in office. So, um, once the new change of presidency happens, what happens? Well, Madison being like the kind of like stiff-necked, hard-willed kind of guy, it's basically like, I ain't delivering these. I hate these guys, right? So he totally drops the papers. Now we have this dude Marbury again, who is super excited for the job to be a part of the prank and all that. And so what does Marbury do? Well, like any self-respecting American, he sues Madison to oblivion. Tries to, and takes him all the way up to the Supreme Court, right? Where we have this guy, Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, John Marshall is, again, a part of the early judicial branch. This was a time when the judicial branch was like, I mean, it existed, it was created by the Constitution, but it was a time when like most people in government didn't really know exactly what the full extent of the judicial branch's power was. And for that reason, it was actually kind of weak. Like, for example, fun fact, the Supreme Court in its like first like 20 or 30 years didn't have an official building for all of its federal proceedings, like dedicated solely to it, unlike the other branches. Again, we see this like lack of like development in the judicial branch, like in simply the size of the constitutional articles alone. Article 1, which is all about the legislature, is like pages and pages detailing this is what Congress can do. This is how Congress is divided. This is how Congress is selected, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, this is, yeah, like I said, this is what Congress's powers are. Super long list, well defined. For the presidency, a little bit less than legislative, but for the most part, like the same of like, we are chalking this full of detail on like what you can be, pages and pages. But once you get to Article 3 of the Constitution, which talks about the judicial branch, you get like 4 or 5 paragraphs, and they're all like pretty broad. So clearly the founding fathers were like, we should have a judicial branch, like a Supreme Court. What that's going to do, I have some vague ideas. We'll talk about them in Federal 78, but for the most part, kind of undefined. So, like I said, we're in this like judicial period where the Supreme Court is like pretty weak, and nobody takes it seriously because, like, again, its powers and responsibilities and limitations are not well defined. But anyways, this court case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, right? Where Marbury is like basically saying like, I am a judge. The paper says it. Madison just won't deliver it. And so, like in any court case, both sides have like key arguments that they're, supposing for like why their judgments should be ruled the way they think. And Marbury's lawsuit is based especially on this concept of a thing called a writ of mandamus. Basically, what Marbury like is suing and telling the courts to do is like, hey, courts, you guys have this power that was granted to you by Congress in like 1790 something. That's called the writs of mandamus that basically says you can command government officials to do certain things. Like Supreme Court, you have that power, right? Um, let's offer. I also want to offer some clarification on writs of mandamus too. So, let me show you this also before we finish this thought. Sorry, I hope I'm not dragging on too much, but again, hopefully this is helpful. Uh, um, okay. I had three questions, right? Like I would have asked you all had I had the opportunity to do a thumbs up, thumbs down test. Like, how many of you guys feel like you can explain writs of mandamus like 100% and get like what it's all about? I tested this with my second hour. We got like a couple of mid thumbs, which again, no shame. That's kind of how I felt too. So I decided to go a little bit of the extra mile and just like get some explanation for those three things for different questions about the writ of mandamus and its context and its history. So let's clarify this. So, number one, what is a writ of mandamus? As I said before, it is a court order that commands a government official or entity to perform a duty they are legally required to do. It's like a legal way of saying, like, hey, you have a job, do it. um, yeah. Now, why was it deemed unconstitutional? In the Supreme Court's ruling from, oh, spoiler, that's the result of the lawsuit. Um, the Supreme Court's ruling in Marbury v. Madison specifically addressed the issue of the Supreme Court issuing a writ of mandamus under the Judiciary Act of 1789. Sorry, it was 1789, not the 90s. Um, the court found that the Act's provision, which granted the Supreme Court the power to issue such writs, was unconstitutional because it expanded the court's original jurisdiction beyond what was specified in the Constitution. So, this follows along the lines of like concept of narrow versus broad interpretations of the Constitution. In this case, Chief Justice John Marshall is relying upon a narrow definition preference of the Constitution, saying that like, look, um, regardless of whether or not Marbury deserves to be made a judge. Um, his claim that the Supreme Court can compel people to do these, that the Supreme Court can issue these writs of mandamus, that is unconstitutional because nowhere in Article 3 of the Constitution does it say anything about the Supreme Court and writs of mandamus. Now I want to clarify one other thing, right? Is it that writs of mandamus themselves are unconstitutional? No, no, no. Writs of mandamus can be like, operate appropriately within like constitutional boundaries, but the problem is it's only just that the Supreme Court itself doesn't have that power. These lower federal courts that we've been talking about, they can't, right? Because they're not like specifically specified as much in the federal constitution, which, it's just that the Supreme Court can't. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, again, email me. Let's talk. I mentioned that in the email. But yeah, so the court found that the X provision. Okay. Yeah, under what context? All right, I think I've explained that. So, wrapping things up, right? Marbury v. Madison, what's the big takeaway? Well, how does this all play out? Like I said, uh, Marbury is actually, or sorry, Chief Justice John Marshall is actually sympathetic to Marbury. For one, because he agrees the paper exists. The president signed the paper at the appropriate time. Therefore, like Marbury, I'm sorry, bro, you should be a judge. But the problem is you are asking me, the Supreme Court, to issue this like, order of compellence to go and force Madison to deliver the paper. And that I can't do. Like that's the one part I disagree with because that's just not specified within the powers for what we the judicial branch are capable of doing. Now, in this process, while this like kind of sucks for Marbury because he's leaving this court case only with sympathy and not the conclusion that he wants, the most important takeaway of Marbury v. Madison is that it establishes this principle of judicial review, that essentially the Supreme Court has the duty, responsibility, and power. Uh, we are lagging. Hopefully that's okay. And if it's not, I'm sorry. I'm probably not going to record this again. Whoa. Okay, I think we're okay. We're back. Um, all right. What was I saying? Judicial review established. Holy crap, my laptop is hot. Quote from John Marshall himself. Key takeaway, quote, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply the rule to particular cases must, of necessity, expound and interpret that rule. If two laws conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. John Marshall. Um, yep. So this is a turning point for the Supreme Court. No longer are we like, in that like 20 to 30-year phase where people like have no clue what we're capable of doing. John Marshall sets a precedent. That's a precedent that this is what the Supreme Court is for to determine, you know, whether laws are constitutional in adherence with the Constitution or whether they violate it. And this is judicial review. So back to our slides. I gotta. Oh, okay. So I would have, again, I would have loved to have talked about this with you all a little bit more because this was like one of my favorite questions from the lesson. But like now that like because of Marbury v. Madison, we've established like the principle of judicial review that is what the Supreme Court's ultimate responsibility is. My question is now, do you actually believe that the Supreme Court is the best institution to be protecting our rights? Like they claim that responsibility, they claim that that's our job now, but are we in safe hands with them? I would ask you to like think about benefits and disadvantages both. Try and look at this like in its imperfections and like certain things that are good. Some common themes I would also want you to think about are like number one, like the principle of representation and connection to the people. The Supreme Court is traditionally like pretty distanced in that like again, we don't vote for like Supreme Court justices directly. It's a process of like president application and then getting reviewed by the Senate. Um, so really distanced from the people, and is this a good thing, right? Related to that is like, we generally we want the most unbiased people possible, like making these judicial hearings, so that justice may be swift and equal. But do we have that element of like, unbiasedness, or do we still have that? Is that the fault that like presidents are allowed to choose in the first place? Should that just be Congress's responsibility to nominate Supreme Court justices? I don't know. Just some thoughts. But yeah, I just want you to ask that question seriously. And fair warning, I said this in my first run through. Now that I remember it, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions to you right now. That's like across all of these readings that obviously we're not going to get to talk about in person, unless again you come to a review room, which we totally can. But what I want you to do is please take them seriously. These questions are specifically going to be catered to really help you with your note taking for those readings because again, they're not going to necessarily be the same as what you'll see on the exam, but I think they're going to be asking you the same things that the exam questions are going to be asking you, albeit in just different wording or a different form, maybe through like a scenario. So please take these questions seriously. It's a resource for you, and it's not meant to be a waste of time, just a guiding thing. So, anyways, thanks. Um, oh yeah. Oh, dang it. Timing's a little off again. But I provided this list also of like just a bunch of like major Supreme Court rulings over the last like like 15 years basically that have like again had some dramatic implications and just big decisions being made. And I tried especially to like get like a mix of both like decisions that I think like the stereotypical Republican would value a lot and the stereotypical Democrat would value a lot, so that like you can see both like things that the Supreme Court does that you like and things that the Supreme Court has done that you would have hated. And the reason I'm doing this is because now I would ask you the question of like, you know, being that like choices always have to be between like one of two things at least. Um, your views, your interests are not always going to be represented by the Supreme Court. And in certain like really big cases that matter a lot, like about the issues that you care about a lot, again, the Supreme Court's not going to do what you want. So how do you handle that? Like, can you do anything about it? I mean, is this a reason why we should be skeptical of the Supreme Court and its responsibility, or is this just like a natural consequence that we really can't do without? Um, Again, if I could stress the importance of that question, I think something that's especially applicable to the BYU campus in that it is a predominantly Christian student body. Think back to Roe v. Wade. Like, forget Dobbs v. Jackson. Let's go back to Roe v. Wade. Which again, I'm not going to pretend like I know the details of it super specifically or completely, but it clearly set a precedent that like abortion is a right. Basically, that there really shouldn't be like bans, boycotts on it, or at least like to a certain extent. And for again for a Christian population, which is like traditionally follows views of like the pro-life campaign positions, this is literally a matter of life or death. I mean, to some people, like that Supreme Court decision was, led to like in certain people's eyes, like, mass murder. Like again, with respect to whatever you believe, I don't, yeah, I don't know how to put it. I'm just like I'm trying at certain points in my lessons. I just have to be careful that I'm not like try like stepping on people's toes here because I don't want to like exclude or like inform unfairly according to my own bias. So like just believe what you believe. I'm just trying to stress that there are certain people that like would find this like sincerely awful. And again, hopefully that stresses the importance. So, all right, definitely talking about that too much. So let's go. Yeah, like I said, what do you do when it doesn't go the way that you want, especially in for really big and important things like abortion? Okay, so now we're on that like last home stretch with the readings. We're going to start with the Jackson speech on the Indian Removal Act, progress on to uh, Cherokee Nation Memorial speech, and then lastly with the Henry David Thoreau. For the first two, we'll cover those guys a little bit more in depth. But for the last uh, Henry David Thoreau, the format is I ask you like basically like six questions across like 4 or 5 slides, and for each of those questions, I've included sort of a response for like how I understood those things might be answered from the Thoreau reading. To be clear, I am not saying that that is an exclusive answer or necessarily the right one. But again, that is my best attempt at like trying to answer that from my own perspective and my own understanding. So just keep that in mind. But again, all these questions are specifically catered to help you address key points that you'll probably see with exam questions. Okay. Um, Holy cow, I just got chills. I'm like, yeah, Zoom, if you don't record this, like, I'm in the Family History Center, but I don't mind. Obscenities will be shouted. Probably not. I'm in church clothes. Um, little introduction to this section. Oh, my shoulders. Uh, as we've seen throughout the semester, the language of equality and freedom provides a powerful impulse to make existing institutions conform and reflect those principles. However, even when using the language of freedom and equality, not every author thinks about equality in the same way. We see this clearly in the three essays that we will read for lab today. I hate that I animate these. Why do I do that? I don't know. I always think it's a good idea late at night and then wake up the next day. I'm just like, you idiot. So unnecessary. Okay. Uh, excuse me. Andrew Jackson's speech on Indian removal. I'm going to read a lot of these just kind of verbatim for a little bit, but I'll stop when I have like thoughts. But some of these genuinely, I think I put enough detail that it's kind of self-explanatory. Um, argues for a liberty and freedom based mainly on a narrow conception of happiness. The white settlers have one view of a good life, and the Indians have another. The views of the settlers take precedent over the views of the Indians. Um, yeah, I'll keep going. He argues that the Indian's way of life does not count for protection. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, according to Jackson, must be pursued within the confines of a specific cultural and political assumptions. Um, okay, here's something I want to say. Um, when I talk about Jackson, I want to be totally transparent with you guys. Like, I really don't like him. Uh, I hate like the aggressiveness of his politics. I hate so many of the choices that he's done, and I generally I don't think highly of him, and I think that's just worth saying. I'm doing my best here just to like represent his perspective as unbiased as possible, but just please keep that in mind. Like, I just want to be fair. But anyways, a question I would ask for this last concept: does this still constitute equality and liberty? Like, does this withhold our values of how we define equality and liberty, the way that Jackson is behaving and making especially certain uh like drawing lines at like where like the extent of liberty and equality goes. In my case, I really don't think so. Eh, at least to me, like again, Jackson does not represent the kind of America I want to be living in, where we are like viewing other cultures in such a demeaning way that their happiness is like irrelevant to our own. Like I feel like there's like a lack of like humanity and commonality like with that perspective. Again, that's my opinion. Um, that said, I wouldn't be surprised if that's a more common sentiment too, that like to a lot of us, like even if you don't like think of Jackson in such extreme terms as I do, like, I think a lot of us would argue that like at least this isn't what I conceive liberty and equality to be, like in its truest form. So to complicate this and make this less of a duh kind of thing, here's a thought. If you would say no to that question, I would follow that up with, do we, if so, I mean, like, do we ever draw a line based on cultural or political assumptions today? Like to how far liberty gets extended, if that makes sense. Um, I bring this up because as much as, again, I strongly disagree with Jackson, and again, like, just hate these choices. Um, I have to be fair to a certain extent that like I think it would be hypocritical for any of us to say that we don't draw these lines. Like maybe again not to the severity that Jackson does, but like let me show you an example. Point number one. Sorry, hopefully this isn't blocking. The so one of the Supreme Court cases that I brought up was the Department of Homeland Security versus the Regents of the University of California 2020. During this particularly impactful Supreme Court decision. Uh, the Trump administration's attempts to end DACA was blocked, which allowed for certain protections for undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children to continue. Right. So this is a clear example of like one group that is advocating for like certain values of liberty and freedom being extended to all, even those who are not technically citizens of the state. And then there's another party who would argue, no, this that citizenship really matters. And if somebody is not a citizen, they aren't being held to the same responsibilities as others, and therefore are not deserving of the same protections. Um, Again, I'm not in this particular case too. I'm really not trying to paint like one side as like being wrong or the other, but I'm just trying to make a point like we are actively drawing lines like constantly and arguing like where lines should be drawn with like certain liberties and protections. And in this case, like again with DACA and immigration, like, I think it's especially clear. Um, yeah. Okay, keep going. Oh my gosh, man, why does it hurt so much? Oh, that felt good. Um, okay, so how does the Cherokee Nation respond to these sentiments? Um, yeah, dadgum animations. The Cherokee Nation obviously disagrees with Jackson's assessment, does not consider these views on his views on equality and liberty to be correct in any way. And their argument follows three really important points that I want you to note. Point number one, the argument made by the Cherokee Nation in response is based in a language of rights. What do I mean by this? Well, think back to our discussions on the Declaration of Independence and the Seneca Falls Declaration. We talked a lot about how, like, you know, this is a time where as soon as the Declaration gets posted, regardless of what the intent of the actual authors was, it has this like overly electrifying language, right? That like gets people really excited for like the implications of liberty and justice for all. Whoa, like and especially for progressive groups like at this time, well, what then was progressive, women's suffrage and I mean, just African Americans and Black people seeking like equal claims of citizenship to, white people at the time that they're being denied. Um, Anyways, the way that they're formulating their arguments to appeal to this like stiff-necked white ruling class is like using their own language kind of against them, right? And so the speech of the Cherokees is written in this constitutional Bill of Rights lingo, that again uses like key phrases that are like supposedly highly esteemed by the other side to again add credibility to their own arguments and point. Um, let's see. So, point number two, Cherokee were surprised to learn that the national government under Jackson did not believe that it had the authority to override what states wanted to do. This means that the rights of the Cherokee Nation and the people in general depended on what states wanted. Okay, so with this particular point, I want to emphasize a comment that was made by Dr. Patterson and Karpowitz in lecture last week. Something that's like intrigued me for a while. So they made this point that during the Jackson era presidency, when Jackson was like, you know, really taking the reins of the executive branch and doing practically whatever he wanted with it, um, the reason why Jackson was kind of enabled to behave this way and again kind of get away with it is because there was a lack of unity across the board, like in government. Not just like a lack of unity between all three branches of the federal government, but there was a lack of unity between state governments and uh, federal government. And anyways, this like lack of unity like had major implications in that like checks and balances, while it existed, like that was ingrained into the Constitution, it was a much less effective auxiliary precaution at like maintaining power. Because again, in order for checks and balances to work, all other parties have to be like um, coordinated in their interest of like keeping other branches in check. And so one of the reasons again one of the reasons why like I call Jackson kind of like like a crazy dude or a psycho is because I mean he's really doing things with the executive branch that nobody else was doing. Like we live in a time right now where it seems like our executive is like super powerful and can do whatever they want. But realistically, our all the other branches of government are a lot more coordinated now. And like in order to get anything major done and like quickly, uh, or anything major done and like have it be a long-term solution, it requires the support of all three branches. But again, in Jackson's time, he was really like he was an aggressive type of president. If he wanted something, he would just do it and get it, right? And again, this lack of unity really enabled him to like jump the hoops of like these checks and balances in certain cases. Not all the time. I'm not saying like he was like totally a tyrant. Like there were obviously some limitations, but again, like it was a much looser time. Like the leash was a lot longer, if that makes sense. Um, wow, my shoulder's really killing me. Um, let's see. Okay, I think I'm beating that point to death, so it's good. Uh, Point number three. Finally, the Cherokee Nation makes its appeal based on Christian principles and the same principles that Jackson said they did not possess and wanted them to adopt. So much of like Jackson's argument is predicated on this idea that like these Native Americans don't really have any concept of what true civilization is. And like, for that reason, we have every right to like move them wherever we want to and like impose on them like our own culture when we so decide because we are doing them a favor. Again, I disagree with that very strongly. But um those his argument was like based on this idea that like we have this like superior form of like culture and civilization because we believe ours to be based on like Christian principles, right? Predominantly Christian nation. Um, and again, that's a big part of Jackson's argument. But the Cherokee Nation themselves, like, they weren't like totally ignorant to the fact of like what Christianity was. In fact, a good portion of the Cherokee Nation at the time wasn't were in fact Christian converts. Not saying all, but there was a portion, and even for those who were not converts themselves, I genuinely believe they had a better grasp on what like true Christian doctrine was back at the time. And so, anyways, what the Cherokee Nation does to again further like try and convince this like unruly like supreme this unruly like white class that is like making calling all the shots and just again totally disrespecting their own authority is basically trying to call them out, being like, you say you guys are these like super Christians and your society's built upon them and that's what makes you superior. We say that you guys are couldn't be farther from the truth, and what it means to be a good Christian. And we know, like, and let me explain some things. So certain points that they make are number one, there's this like form of biblical authority. Uh, Wait, how do I put this? Sorry. Go back. Jackson. Sorry. I know we're so close, and I just really need to tie this off. Um, man, it's getting so painful. Okay, give me like 10 seconds. Got to give him property rights. Okay. Um, First principle that we're establishing is this idea that like God gives man rights, right? And Jackson is arguing that like these guys don't have like the reason we can keep violating these treaties and moving wherever we want is because you guys don't really have a good claim on this land. But the Cherokee Nation argues that like you guys like God gives man many things. God gives man like all sorts of rights, and some of those rights include property rights. We believe, like truthfully, that like being here first, God gave us this land on purpose. Like He made it ours, and He asked us to like take care of it. And you stealing from us is not just like is not just an internal issue. This is an issue with you, me, and God, because you stealing my land is actually a violation of the will of God Himself. So heavy argument, right? Um, Following this up, there are other principles of like, again, critiquing the government for not being as virtuous as they suppose themselves to be. One example of this is like with the treaties that I've been saying, like this is not the first time and it's not the last time that the government has basically told these Native Americans, okay, so we just moved here, we need this territory. So you have to leave, but we'll give you this other territory. 20 years later, we keep expanding, we push upon that territory, and we're like, so we actually need to expand to this territory again. You need to leave. We'll give you this spot, and we just keep pushing, right? And so the Cherokee Nation points out that like our history with the federal government is a history of lies. You keep making these promises, telling us these are our lands, and yet you keep moving us, changing the deal, changing the bargain, and the cycle repeats on and on and on. Um, how dare you claim to be like you can't claim to be these like super Christians that you suppose yourselves to be when like, your whole government is based upon lies and deception. Um, big principles. So the point goes on, but like I said, we're in two respects, we are trying to use the language of our oppressors against them. Number one, through the language of rights. Relating back to Declaration and Constitution and speaking like indirect quotation wording of those things. And number two, we're also trying to attack them on the basis of their self-identification as Christian and basically trying to like argue that like you guys couldn't be farther from like these super Christians that you imagine yourselves to be, and here's like a long list of reasons why. Yeah. Um, okay, one last thing. I worry maybe I'm speaking a little bit too aggressively. A good portion of the Cherokee Nation rhetoric is like critical attacking, but a lot of it too is like sympathetic, like uh a lot of it is sympathetic compromising and like seeking like, can you understand why we feel this way? It's not all just being like, you guys suck, give it back. uh, Anyways, so let's just be clear on that. It's a more diverse argument. It's not as black and white as like singular emotions. Okay, we're almost there. All right, here's how the last little bit's gonna work. uh I've got an introduction. I'll read that again for this next section with the Henry David Thoreau bit. I'm probably saying his name wrong. I don't really need to get corrected though. There's going to be quite a few slides where it's just like question format, and again, like my how I would respond to them. Just to be clear, I said it before. These are not like all in the sole answers to these questions, though. Again, I put a lot of work, and they're how I would best answer them in a lot of cases. But just keep in mind the value of these questions is that they're meant to guide you on the exam. And it's like the third time I said it, but like I really want to hammer it in. All right, home stretch, baby. Let's do this. All right. Um, I'm already tired. Ah, let's read. How about that? Thorough exemplifies the most thoroughgoing form, of individualism and freedom. He takes the idea of equality to an entirely different place than what the authors we have read than the other authors we read for today. For Thoreau, the freedom and equality are not elements found within a government framework. Freedom and equality are achieved outside of the normal course of politics. Um, okay. So question number one, I would have asked. From the many readings and ideas we have covered throughout this semester so far, which one do you think comes closest to what Thoreau articulated in this particular essay? Um, One of the biggest thoughts I came up with is I think there's this really big connection between the libertarian perspective and what Henry David Thoreau is arguing for. Thoreau articulates a framework that is close to what libertarians would argue. He says on page 38, I heartily accept the motto that government is best which governs the least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Um, yeah, we'll keep touching back on this with a lot of them. Why does Thoreau seem to be outwardly hostile towards any and all forms of government? Thoreau seems to argue that any form of government simply reflects those who are physically the strongest. So Poor representation across the board for the true people that the government supposedly protects. Very critical perspective. Question number three. Does mankind have a specific nature? If so, what is it? And what is the relationship between nature and government? So, a fun little human nature question right there, right? Woo. Um, uh, Point number A, Thoreau argues that human beings have a natural sense of justice and liberty. Government only corrupts these senses, and for that reason, government should be avoided. It is not that simply man is naturally corrupt, it is government that corrupts man, and it is corporations that also corrupt humans. Thoreau is simply suspicious of all forms of government organizations for collective purposes. So, another really great tie in right here. Uh, I Noble Savages guy, which I think it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You can fact check me on that, but I think it was Rousseau. Um, this concept of the noble savage saying that like in a state of nature where like everybody starts at a blank slate, there are no institutions in society, we can expect that men are morally good. They have a sense of direction, a sense of justice, like Thoreau is talking about. However, Rousseau argues that like it is once man is exposed to institutions, he's exposed to property rights, exposed to law and legislation, that he becomes corrupted. That all of the good things that we esteem in its original states, I mean, not all are lost, but again, many are corrupted and lost. So yeah, anything else I want to say on that? Nope, I think that's it. The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army, and the militia, jailers, constables, posse, uh, comitatus, etc. In most cases, there's no free exercise whatever of the judgment of the or of the moral sense. Um, Weird quote now that I think about it, but I think the point I was getting at here is just like he's really trying to point out like exactly how people are getting corrupted. Um, like you know, we really hope that like these government politicians, once they get into office, that like oh, I think I might be talking about this next. Yeah, okay. This is kind of blends in well with the next one, but the point I'm trying to make is like there may be a few good men in government still who still have a conscience, who still act by it, and are not like have not yet been corrupted. But government as a whole generally will corrupt always those who come in, like even those with like the brightest of hearts, and it doesn't make us better as a nation. It makes us worse. And I think this is really well expressed with this like quote here, number four. In other words, a very few as heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers, and in the great sense, and men, uh, serve the state with their consciences also, uh, and so necessarily resist it for the most part, and they are commonly treated as enemies by it. Um, yeah, good gets choked out in government, in his eyes. Uh, Also, to this other point, what is a nation? Thoreau argues governments do not make nations. Nations are made by the people who belong outside of governments, like again, a people who have yet to be corrupted. Um, Anyways, so yeah. Uh, I worry about this, but like every time I always bring up Parks and Rec now, like I hear less and less people who like understand these references because I guess they missed the window of like the greatest television ever. But you guys, for those of you, my loyal ones who know Parks and Rec and its greatness, like there should be like some major Ron Swanson bells just like dinging in your head being right now, where it's like, holy fetch, it's like Ron Swanson would love this. So, anyways, if you know, you know. Patriots in a serve state, but they serve humanity by bringing individuals to an awareness that the state is simply coercing them. Yeah. So uh, the best of us are the ones who are like actively fighting against the corruption and coercion of government and trying to like help people realize that like this is what it does. Government is a snake that like you know lulls you into a false sense of security and then strangles you like the boa constrictor it is, the evil beast. Question number five. If you accept Thoreau's argument, what are the implications for the rituals and practices of democracy? Voting, obeying the law, and other forms of interaction with the government are all simply a means of perpetuating the authority of the state over the individual. Consequently, the individual has no real duties or obligations to the state, only to the laws of nature that make men free in the first place. Final questions. What are the virtues and the potential weaknesses of Thoreau's understanding of freedom and equality? Okay, actually, these last questions, I don't have answers for you. But I want you to please, again, take them seriously. Just give it at least 30 seconds. You can do that. If you stuck around this long, you probably have at least a little bit more time. Sorry. But yeah, what are the virtues and the potential weaknesses of Thoreau's understanding of freedom and equality? Specifically, what are the pros and cons of hostility towards government? Do you think Thoreau's vision of human nature and government make you any safer or secure? If you answer no, would Thoreau really care? Probably not. Anyways, all right, that's basically it. Seriously, thank you for sticking around. I know that was long, but I hope this is helpful. I'm sorry, this has just been a wild day, and again, I can't believe that this is my second time recording, like an hour. That's okay. You guys are great. I said it in the email. Just reach out to me. How can I help you? Uh, I know this is like a non-traditional week. Oh, also, just reply to the email. Like, you don't have to like answer any responses. I'm not going to ask any questions. Be like, hey, so what did you think about number five? All I need you to do is just reply to this email, the one with the video attachment, and just say like, hey, this is so and so. I read it or I watched it. That's great, and I'll give you like I'll record in my book full participation and uh, full participation and attendance for the day. So, yeah. Anything else? Oh yeah, the other video I attached, which is the only sliver that remains from my first recording. The last 6 minutes was actually my Kentucky resolutions bit. And so yeah, I promised this like 2 weeks back. I just wanted to or like just a week back because it was a point that we kind of had to rush at the end, and I just like didn't give it like the attention I wanted to. There really wasn't much to say, but there's some useful context that'll set us up for the future and explain its relevance later on. Keyword nullification. If you know what that means, you're probably fine. If you don't, go watch that video. Um, or unsure. Okay, I think that's basically it. I'm probably gonna have this like awkward pause for a second while I uh, click stop share tentatively because I'm so afraid I'm going to lose it all again. Um, oh, pray for me. All right, and stop share. Goodbye. Oh, wait, no, that's stop share. Dang it. So awkward. Uh, pause the recording and stop the recording. Okay, goodbye.